In this video, we're going to keep going on with Chapter 1 and talk a little bit more about introducing us to psychology and the scientific way of thinking. So our next topic is talking about the three main levels of analysis. And these are going to be three topics, three ideas or ways of framing things that are going to come up periodically throughout the course. So this is something that's going to come up chapter and chapter again. So it's a good idea to learn them now because we're going to keep using them. And on the screen here, we have our three different levels. And you'll notice that our three levels are connected by these double-headed arrows. And that's meant to imply that no one level is going to be better than the other. And in fact, they show interactions between each other. So you can consider things from more than one level. So the first of these levels is the biological level. So you can consider a situation from the side of biology. You could think about the brain processes that are going on, the hormones within the body, or the genetic influences acting on a behavior. Our next level of analysis, we can look at the psychological level. So if we're thinking about the psychology of things, the mental components, our thoughts and feelings, things that are motivating us. And then our third level of analysis is the environmental level. So if it's not our internal motivations or our biological motivations, it's something external from our environment. So past and current physical and social environments that are all around us all the time. And so if we want an example of how we could use these different levels of analysis, let's consider why someone eats. So if you're looking at a person and they're sitting on a bench somewhere eating an orange, you could ask yourself, why are they eating that orange? At the biological level, we could say, well, they're probably eating that orange because they're hungry. Something in their internal environment has told them that they need extra nutrients, they need more energy, and so they've picked something to eat that will help them replenish those energy levels. On the psychological level, maybe they're thinking about an orange. Maybe they saw a commercial that showed them an orange and they've wanted one ever since. Or maybe it's something that helps them feel relaxed or comfortable or whatever an orange makes someone feel. And then on the environmental level, maybe somebody handed them an orange, so they figured they'd sit down and eat it. And so we can use these different levels of analysis in a whole bunch of different ways, but the important part is that these levels help us shape and mold how we consider a situation. So you can consider the biological side of things. You can consider the psychological side of things or the environmental side of things. And again, these aren't mutually exclusive. You don't only look at things biologically, you're going to look at them biologically and maybe also psychologically, or maybe you're going to look at all three depending on the kind of research that you're doing. So these are good to keep in mind. Next, we're going to talk about some additional topics that will carry throughout the course. And these are going to be our perspectives on behavior. And these will eventually lead us into different schools of psychology and ways of framing information, kind of like our different levels of analysis, but a little bit more specific to situations. So we've already talked about the fact that psychology is a very broad field, and we have roots in all sorts of different fields. So information has come from biology and neuroscience and all sorts of things. And because people who have come into psychology have such diverse and varied backgrounds, in psychology, people have a lot of different perspectives or points of view that they bring to the table when they're considering a different question. And so a lot of these perspectives are linked to the history of psychology and how different ideas within psychology have evolved over time. So for the next little bit, we're actually going to talk about some of the history of psychology because it gives us some insight into why people consider psychology the way they do, why they look at different problems the way they do, and where some of these schools of thought or perspectives have come from. So our first perspective is the idea of mind-body dualism. And this mind-body dualism is a belief that the mind is a spiritual entity that is not governed by the same rules as the physical body. So people who subscribe to the idea of mind-body dualism think that the mind is something special. It's spiritual and therefore unknowable. And so if we have this idea that the mind is something untouchable and unattainable, and the body is something very different, for a field like psychology, where the intent is to study behavior and the mind, we run into some issues here. So maybe it's going to be difficult to study the mind if we're considering it a spiritual and separate entity. And we'll come back to that. The tie into history is, if the mind and body are two separate pieces, if they are different sort of states of being, how do they interact? And so this is going to bring us back a very, very long time ago. And this is the first time that we're seeing dates. So I always take a moment to pause here and say that I include dates just so that you have a reference about how far back in history I'm talking about. I will never ever ask a question that says specifically, what year did this happen in? Or in this year, what was the most common perspective or something like that. I have trouble remembering dates myself, so I don't ask questions about dates. So you don't have to remember those. So on that topic, sort of in the late 1500s, early 1600s, back that far approximately, René Descartes was a very famous and prominent philosopher and scientist. And he had this idea that the mind and body are separate, and that the mind and body interact via the pineal gland. So this tiny little structure right in the center of our brain. And this pineal gland would somehow allow our spiritual mind to interact with our physical body and allow us to sort of consciously influence our behavior. So we could move our arm because this pineal gland allowed us to turn our thoughts of moving our arm into something physical in the body. And interestingly, if you look more into some of his theories, he thought that this interaction between the mind and the body, this ability to move your limbs, happened through the use of animal spirits. So he thought there were these gaseous entities that allowed us to move our body at the command of our spiritual mind. So philosophy was an interesting place to look into back at that point in time. But what we're going to take from this is that the overall idea for people who subscribe to the idea of mind-body dualism was that, well, the mind is separate, and in this case they're saying it's going to reside within the brain, but it isn't the brain. So the brain itself is not our mind. Our mind is that spiritual force that connects to us through our brains. And so, like I kind of hinted at a little bit earlier, if we have this idea of the mind as a spiritual entity and the body as a physical entity, we run into the issue where it's very difficult to study the mind. And so mind-body dualists would believe that no amount of studying the physical body would give you any kind of useful information about that non-physical and spiritual mind. So if we have no hope of understanding something as abstract as a spirit, why would you even try and study the mind? So from that idea, mind-body dualists thought that psychology was a lost cause. Psychology didn't exist at the time, but the ideas that evolved into psychology were something that they would have scoffed at, thinking that it was a waste of everyone's time. And that brings us to our next sort of school of thought, our next way of thinking, and this is monism. And what you're going to notice as we go through all of these different perspectives is that a lot of these perspectives come in response to the one that came before. So our mind-body dualism had that idea of the mind and the body being separate. Monism takes a different stance, and their core belief was that the mind and the body are one. So the mind isn't a separate spiritual entity, it's actually part of our physical body. And that's going to become important because our mind-body dualists said there was no point in trying to study the mind because it was unknowable. But if monists have removed that spiritual component, then studying the mind is all of a sudden fair game. And so our core figure here is Thomas Hobbes. His range of time was a little bit past what we had looked at for our dualists. His theories came about sort of in contrast to that mind-body dualism. But Hobbes said that mental events are a product of physical events. So thinking about something, having thoughts, came directly from physical events within our body. So our brains were creating these thoughts, and therefore it wasn't some separate unknowable entity. And this is hugely important for psychology because it gives us this idea that the mind could be studied by looking at those physical processes, those physical events that were causing mental events, that were creating our thoughts. So our next group, our next perspective are the British empiricists. And the core idea for British empiricism is that all of our ideas and knowledge are gained empirically. So empiricism because of the empiric gaining of knowledge. And we're gaining all of this knowledge through the senses. So their main idea is that observation is something that's very important. Looking at your environment and taking in information is going to be the most valid way of collecting information and of learning things. And they're saying it's more valid than pure reason, because pure reason is fraught with the potential for error. And in the term of history at this point in time, a lot of philosophy, which counted for science at that time, a lot of that was driven by reasoning. And so what that means is if you were a philosopher, if you were a scientist, you would sit somewhere in a room, possibly with a group of other like-minded individuals, and you would reason through an idea. If you were trying to understand how the mind worked, then you'd sit in a room with a bunch of other people and talk about how it seemed the mind should work. What was the reason for things happening? What's the logical conclusion? And if you could all reason your way to the same conclusion, to the same idea of what was driving the mind, well then that must be right because that's what your reasoning brought you to. And for us nowadays, that idea of a bunch of people sitting around and logicking their way to science doesn't really hold water. But at the time, that's where the field sat. Until our British empiricists, who started pushing this idea of observation, of going out and observing things in the world, and that eventually evolved into us not just observing things, but also manipulating things, having experimental data, not just observational data. So this is a pretty important turning point for psychology, but also for science in general. And our key figure here is John Locke, who had the idea that philosophy should focus on the capabilities and the extent of the human mind. So instead of just purely reasoning to understand the human mind. He wanted to focus on observing and studying the mind in a more scientific manner, and also look at these capabilities and the extent of our mind. So how much can the human mind remember? What is it capable of? What are its limits? So trying to observe the extent of what it is. And so we're going to jump ahead a little bit in time, and we're going to come to sort of our next big revolution in the field. And still, psychology doesn't exist as it does now. There isn't a field called psychology at this point, but we're going to look at physiology and medicine, which helped psychology get to where it is today. And so we're looking at about the 1800s, when we started seeing a lot of advances in physiology and medicine. And so physiology is a subset of biology, specifically looking at how the body functions. So if you have taken an anatomy course, you'd know quite a bit about physiology and how the body is working. And so at the time, they had started using electrical stimulation, so they could cut open people's heads and apply electrical current to different parts of the brain and map what happened when they touched certain areas. So they could create these functional maps that would tell you what different parts of the brain seemed to do. So not just observing things, but also manipulating things and seeing what happened. And so they could, say, apply an electrical current to the very back of your brain, towards the base of your skull, what we now call the occipital lobe. And we know that that's responsible for a lot of our visual perception. And they figured that out by applying an electrical current to that part of the brain and noticing that people's vision would go away. They couldn't see for a time until the brain recovered. Instead of experimental stimulation, they could also look at people who had brain damage. So you could look at someone after they had died, cut open their head, look at their brain, and if somebody who had behavioral problems or some kind of mental impairment, if after their death you saw that part of their brain was formed differently, maybe there was an abscess, a hole, or a missing chunk of the brain, you could then make a conclusion that that part of the brain might be responsible for the behaviors that they had problems with, because you're seeing damage and you saw behavioral problems. So lots of different ways that people were starting to make these scientific conclusions about how our bodies were working. At this time, we also had the field of psychophysics. And so we can break this down: psycho like psychology and physics like physics. And in this case, they were studying how psychologically experienced sensations, so the things that we see or feel or hear, the stuff we're experiencing from our senses, how those depend on the characteristics of physical stimuli. So how does the physical properties of a specific beam of light, how does that affect how you perceive that light? Or how the perceived loudness of a sound changes as the physical intensity of the sound wave changes. So trying to look at it not only from the physical body side of things, but also the physics side of things, and understanding those stimuli. And then our next big event is a really big one. And this is where we bring in the theory of evolution. And evolution has had an effect on so many fields, so many ways of thinking. And so, of course, the person who proposed the theory of evolution is Charles Darwin. And one of the cool reasons why we care so much about Darwin and his theories is because he was proposing something that at the time was completely radical. And the first of these is the idea that humans aren't special. up until this point, a lot of science looked at humans as sort of the epitome of existence. Humans were the best. They were their own creatures, their own creations. And then there were animals. But with Darwin, he said that not only are humans not that special, humans are just another species of animal. And so, of course, at the time, this caused riots. This angered pretty much everybody in the field. And then nowadays, people have come around to that idea quite a bit more. But back at the time, that was a big deal. And so, as we start accepting that humans aren't special, that we're just another animal, it's giving us more support to the idea that the mind isn't a spiritual entity. It isn't separate and special. The mind must be some extension of our physical body. So bringing us back to some of the ideas started with our monists quite a long time ago. And if we've accepted that humans aren't special, we're just another animal, and the mind is not something spiritual and separate, then we can make some conclusions here. So we could actually start understanding humans and our mental capacity by studying other animals. And this is where the idea of learning about humans by studying some of our closest relatives started to gain some traction. So we could start looking at cognition, thoughts and interpretations of information in things like chimpanzees, and then extrapolate that, apply what we've learned with those species to what we know about humans. So gaining more knowledge from different places. And so now we're going to move from some of the earlier perspectives, and we're going to come into some schools of thought. And again, these are going to be different ideas that are shaping how we're looking at science that will become psychology. So the first of our schools is Structuralism. And our major person here is Wilhelm Wundt. And so we're still looking at sort of the late 1800s, early 1900s. So just after this big revolution in medicine and our understanding of human physiology, and Wundt established the first experimental psychology laboratory at the University of Leipzig in Germany. So this is when we're starting to see psychology as an actual field. Psychology is becoming a thing. And having an experimental psychology lab, we're having a place where they're not just observing people and their behaviors, they're actually experimenting, they're manipulating their behaviors to gain better understanding. So this was another big deal. And just an FYI Canadian fact, once pupils, his students, ended up being founding members of the Department of Psychology at the University of Toronto, and another started experimental psychology at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. So we have direct descendants who kicked off psychology programs here in Canada. And I include that just as a little factoid. I think it's interesting. And so from who was involved in structuralism, we can go into, well, what even was structuralism? And for structuralism, they were interested in studying the mind in terms of its very basic elements. So they wanted to break consciousness and mental processes down into their structural components. So if you think about it, they were breaking everything down into its basic building blocks. What pieces, what tiny blocks come together to allow us to think all of the thoughts that we think. And one of the ways that they did this was using what's called introspection. And introspection is the idea of looking within yourself and describing your own experiences. So you'd sit and focus on the sensations you were experiencing. And you would sort of break those down into their basic elements to try and understand consciousness. Now you might be saying, wait a minute, this sounds an awful lot like some of those early schools of thought, some of those early perspectives where people were sitting down and talking through things and using reasoning as a stand-in for science, which it kind of was. And that's why structuralism didn't gain a whole lot of traction, and it didn't stick around for a very long time. So this school was criticized because it was too subjective. It was relying, again, on reasoning and introspection instead of experimentation and observation. So this field died out within a few decades, but it did start things in motion. It did create the push for other schools to evolve and develop in contrast to this school of thought. And that brings us to our next school, which is functionalism. And this was a follow-up to structuralism. So functionalism came because so many people disagreed with structuralism and they wanted to propose something that they thought was better. And so instead of focusing on the building blocks, the little pieces, the structure of the mind, functionalism studied the function of our consciousness. So they wanted to look at, well, what does the mind actually do? And they were strongly influenced by the theory of evolution. They were looking at what was the adaptive benefits of the mind forming the way it did. There should be some kind of benefit for the mind evolving the way it did. And so they're going to stress the importance of adaptation in the survival and reproduction of organisms. And we'll talk more about the specifics of evolution and adaptation as we get into those chapters in the textbook, but we'll just touch on it very briefly here. And so if we want an example to help differentiate our structuralism versus functionalism, we could consider our hands. So a structuralist would try and explain how our hands work by studying our muscles and our tendons and our bones. So the structuralist would be concerned with the structures that let our hands function. Whereas a functionalist wouldn't care so much about the structures. They would ask about what our hands do, what their function is, and how they let us operate in our environment. And so for a famous face to link to functionalism, we could talk about William James. And he was really important because he helped widen the scope of psychology. So instead of just focusing on mental processes and how the mind works, instead of being a pure psychological level of evaluation or level of analysis, he broadened it to include biological and other mental processes, as well as external behavior. Overt meaning something that you could observe externally. So James made it a little bit broader and made psychology more open and considering of other perspectives. And so again, functionalism, as it existed at the time, didn't stick around for very long. It did what it needed to do and moved psychology along, and it was replaced by other perspectives, other ways of looking at things. But we can see a lot of the ideas and the traditions established by functionalism in modern day fields. So if you've looked at cognitive psychology, which I've mentioned is a field that I'm involved in, where we look at mental processes and how we're functioning mentally in an environment, as well as evolutionary psychology. Those two are both very strongly descended from functionalism.